China's diplomatic initiatives are in full swing since it reopened after bringing the COVID-19 pandemic under control.
If China becomes very open and becomes diplomatically engaging with those countries, China would have an advantage.
However, there are concerns whether Beijing is trying to challenge the US-led world order.
By definition, it's a challenge to the United States-led world order, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad.
China hosted the first China Central Asia Summit in its ancient capital Xi'an for the leaders of 5 Central Asian countries to deepen ties with the region, from trade and economy to security and cultural cooperation. President Xi Jinping said the summit would have far-reaching influence on China's relations with Central Asian countries, and China was ready to chart a blueprint for cooperation for sustained growth of relations with the region.
This is important because some of them have very close relations with Russia, some of them have very close relations with the United States, some have close relations with India, some have close relations with Pakistan. The nations I talked about don't necessarily get along with each other. And so for China, China wants to have as good relations as possible with all of these countries, whether it's economic relations or diplomatic relations.
China's diplomatic drive has more than the Xi'an summit. From late March to April, leaders from Spain, Singapore, Malaysia, France, the European Union, Brazil, and Gabon came one after another for dialogue.
So Central Asia, Europe, Latin America, Africa prioritize economic, stable conditions and good relations with both the US and the Chinese. If China becomes very open and becomes diplomatically engaging with those countries, China would have an advantage.
I tend to think that what these countries are expecting from China is a little bit of support, which will give them the ability to be a bit more independent in foreign policy. Not completely independent necessarily, because a lot of those countries have really close ties to the United States, but even if it gives them a little bit of extra room where they can make a couple of independent decisions, then that's beneficial for them.
China surprised the world when it brokered a Saudi Arabia-Iran truce earlier this year. Now it has a peace plan to resolve the Russia-Ukraine conflict. A month after President Xi's visit to Russia, he held a phone conversation with Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, reiterating that China's core position on the conflict is to promote peace and talks.
What happened between Saudi Arabia and Iran is very important, and China could be seen by those two countries as an honest broker in that Iran and Saudi Arabia both have good relations with China and believe that China is acting not as an active player in all of this, but as an honest neutral.
The call between President Xi and President Zelensky was an interesting event, but I have my doubts about whether China can play a role in mediating this conflict. The main reason for that is that the conflict in the Ukraine is not really between Russia and Ukraine, but rather between Russia and NATO. And NATO is an expansionist, aggressive alliance which has negative intentions for China as well as for Russia.
China's efforts to mediate in the conflict might not result in an instant diplomatic breakthrough, but the notable thing is that it's willing to get involved. Back in the 1990s, China's foreign policy philosophy was about hiding its capabilities and biding its time. It was to avoid conflict with the United States and ramp up economic growth.
1991, the Soviet Union collapses, and that means the structural configuration of the system has changed from a bipolarity to a unipolarity, with the US standing at the top of the global pecking order. China could be seen as a rising competitor. Thus, the fundamentals in the relationship between China and the US changed substantially after 1991. And that was Deng Xiaoping's understanding, and his vision was that China needs development. China should not provoke the US. That means China should allow the US to be the leader.
However, the policy began to shift when China's political and economic influence grew around the globe. In 2013, President Xi proposed the Belt and Road Initiative, a global connectivity project aimed to improve infrastructure, transport, and cooperation on a transcontinental scale. Since then, 3 more global initiatives have followed: the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative.
The common ground is basically to propose a way that a series of principles that allow different countries with different histories and backgrounds to come together and cooperate and have some sort of shared understanding about how the world's going to work in a post-unipolar world.
This is to show that China is a power beyond economics, and that China not only can be a mediator in terms of important global issues, but can be a leader, and in fact can be an alternative to the American way or the European way. And so I think that this is something that could take several decades to fully bloom.
The U.S. now sees China as its primary rival and the most consequential geopolitical challenge. Relations between the two powers have been tense for years over a number of issues, including Taiwan, trade and technology, and more recently, the Ukraine crisis. Some even say China is acting like a global power and trying to challenge the US-led world order.
I think it's true by definition that China is challenging the United States as a global power. The United States, since the end of the Cold War, has been, to use the Chinese term, hegemonic, meaning the only superpower in terms of everything from economics to military.
So anybody who articulates any principles that the US is not articulating is going to be seen as making that challenge. Now, that doesn't mean that China has some sort of ulterior motive in promoting better global governance.
When the Chinese and American presidents met for the first time since President Joe Biden took office in 2020, both said they were looking for ways for their countries to coexist despite disagreements. But tensions rose once more after the US this year shot down what it insisted was a Chinese spy balloon entering US airspace to collect intelligence. Top officials of both countries met in Vienna in May for candid and constructive talks.
If there is one thing that China can do, I would say it's to continue its dialogue with the US. And no matter how difficult is their relationship right now, I think it's a priority for dialogue and engagement to remain part of the strategic equation.
I think that that's the most important thing, is communication, to make sure that there is not an accident that turns into an emergency. More importantly, I think that the way to get things back on track is to work together on some issues of common interest, to try to figure out a way to engage in a positive way on issues that both governments care about.
It seems that open communication is the only way to get ties between the two countries back on track, and it's hoped that future bilateral dialogues will diffuse tensions.